On Guy Fawkes Night 1995, Princess Diana had made careful preparations for Martin Bashir and the BBC crew's clandestine visit.
Nobody in the department that night, nobody. The princess had made sure that everybody was gone.
William and Harry had gone off to a firework party, and there were just the four of us.
At base, nervous BBC executives wanted news that the interview was in the can.
We all just had the evening to wait for the phone call. And we waited. And we waited.
After we'd rigged and I was happy with the lighting, we more or less went into the interview. At no stage did she want to look at the picture on a monitor. She must have just been confident with her own image.
Your Royal Highness, how prepared were you?
Her look was very carefully calculated. She was wearing far too much eye makeup, which made her eyes look bigger. She was looking doe-eyed. She was looking vulnerable.
As the interview was being filmed, Diana stopped at a critical point. When asked about her own infidelity, she sought help from the crew, even though the interview was supposedly in her own words.
Another book that was published recently concerned a Mr. James Hewitt, in which he claimed to have had a very close relationship with you from about 1980.
The question Diana had a problem answering was with regards to James Hewitt, when Martin asked her, was she unfaithful? And she didn't quite know how to phrase her answer. We stopped recording. After some discussion, she was then happy with how she would answer. And the answer she gave was,
were you unfaithful?
Yes, I adored him. Yes, I was in love with him.
Which was quite a clever answer when you think about it.
Did Martin help her frame that answer?
Yeah, I think the discussion between Martin and Mike, the producer, I think, and Diana herself, helped her phrase an appropriate answer.
After a tense 2.5 hours, they wrapped.
When the interview was finished, that's when Diana got the champagne out. I think everybody needed a drink after that.
It was late at night when the phone eventually rang and the editor of Panorama said to me, "They're out and it's in the can. It's safe."
Travelling back, there was certainly an air from Mike and Martin of tension. Are we being followed? And I don't know whether Martin said it or Mike said it, that, can you believe what we've just heard? This is just amazing. Did she really say that? And it only occurred to me then that this is earth-shattering.
This interview had the potential to destroy what many in the BBC regarded as an appropriately special relationship with the palace.
In doing that programme, the BBC was taking on, to a degree, the royal machine and was challenging the historic close relationship between the BBC and the palace, and there would be consequences.
With this much at stake, the Director General, John Burt, would need to be directly involved. So he met with Tony Hall, then head of news, and Richard Eyre to discuss this diplomatic difficulty, when another problem arose.
The three of us all identified one serious issue, the very difficult position of the chairman of the BBC. The chairman, Duke Hussey, was married to Lady Susan Hussey, who was and still is the Queen's lady-in-waiting. She's also godmother to Prince William.
And what terrified Diana was that Marmaduke Hussey would put a stop to doing the interview. So it was absolutely necessary for Martin Bashir and his colleagues to be secretive.
I think the right decision was taken by John Burt not to tell Dukey, to save him from this position.
The The interview had been done without the knowledge of Hussey or the BBC Board of Governors. And this secrecy now extended to the editing of the programme. A clandestine edit room was set up miles away from the BBC in an Eastbourne hotel suite. They had less than 2 weeks to make transmission, and the film editor had not even been told about the content.
Martin and Mike, the producer, waltzed in with a pile of tapes, grinning slightly, and said, "Guess who we've got on film?" And I didn't have a clue.
Your Royal Highness,
And of course, as we started playing, every answer was more extraordinary than the last. She was so honest, so open, so transparent, and that was a real shock.
There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded.
It was just, wow.
Diana's Panorama interview had been in the secret edit in an Eastbourne hotel suite for just a week, when the BBC executives set off for a trip to the seaside.
We went up to the 3rd or 4th floor to a suite at the end of the corridor. This was probably the least likely place for a world scoop to be produced. Everything was black, highly secretive. It was pretty tense, and they pressed the start button.
But the fairy tale wasn't to be. Tonight on Panorama, the Princess of Wales.
And for as long as it took, we watched. When the programme stopped, you could hear a pin drop. We were shocked, I'm genuinely shocked. This was the woman who, even though they had been separated for years, was officially still destined to be our future queen, explaining why she could no longer live with the future king. And I said, this film could bring down the royal family, or the BBC, or both. And there's absolutely no doubt that it's got to be transmitted.
Unknown to management, someone had already removed a negative comment about a senior royal from the final interview in order to protect Diana and the programme.
There was another aside about a member of the royal family, which some people felt wouldn't be helpful in the film.
The Green Mother.
No comment.
With the programme almost finished and transmission only a week away, the BBC needed to make a delicate decision.
Once John Burt had seen the programme and approved it, we were left with one big remaining problem. When do we announce it? And who do we tell first? Remember, the princess had made just 2 stipulations right at the start of this process, according to Martin Bashir. One, that she didn't want anybody to find out about it before it had taken place. And secondly, that she should be able to inform the palace.
Given she had control over when to tell the palace, Diana would need to be consulted about when the BBC would tell the world.
Martin suggested we should ask Princess Diana. He slipped out of the room to phone her. A while later, he came back in. He said that she had suggested a date, which just happened to be Prince Charles's birthday.
Do you remember the date?
Yes, but it's in my notes. I think it was Tuesday the 14th. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Do you know why that might be significant?
No.
It's Prince Charles's birthday.
Oh, really? Frankly, I doubt if any of us involved actually had that date in our diaries.
It may be that Bashir and co said, well, we want to announce it on the 14th of November, and she would have said, oh, that's my husband's birthday. Yes, why not? But
what if she had stipulated that she wanted it announced on his birthday?
Well, I would have thought that was typically mischievous Diana.
She was manipulative. She was trying to butter her toast both sides. She was cunning and clever, and she knew exactly what her game was, right? She was going to get her revenge in a public sense.
The BBC say the 14th was the earliest date that Diana could inform the Queen, even though she had returned from an overseas tour 2 days before. In the end, Diana told the palace just moments before the BBC went public.
We were informed 10 minutes before they announced it. It came to me as a complete shock, and it came to everyone else in the palace as a complete shock. And that would include the Queen as well. And the princess's view was pretty much, look, don't worry, there's nothing new in it. And that was basically the line. You know, it wasn't going to reassure me or anyone else. The BBC were holding it very, very close, so there was no question of them saying anything. You really had to wait then until the programme went out.
At the same time, BBC Director General John Burt finally informed the governors about the forthcoming programme. The chairman, Marmaduke Hussey, said later that Burt had also been economical with the truth about its contents, saying that he'd seen the programme and there was nothing significant in it. The BBC say the minutes of the meeting don't mention a discussion about Panorama, and it refutes claims that executives intended to deceive the chairman.
It's been the talking point of the week. The Princess of Wales's planned TV interview on Monday is likely to attract a record audience. Her decision to go public has led to speculation over what she might say.
The BBC, specifically the production team, were now under extreme pressure to release details about the programme.
The BBC employed a security firm of ex-SAS men to guard the film and to be with me in the edit suite. I also had the tapes locked in a safe, because at that time a number of the papers were offering large rewards for even a frame of the programme.
There are a lot of lies printed. One of the newspaper articles had printed that I had advised on what clothes she should wear. And I thought this is unbelievable. Yes, you're going to seek the advice of some oik when you're the best-dressed woman in the world.
On the day of the Panorama broadcast, the BBC and the Palace braced themselves for a programme that would change their futures. Meanwhile, 23 million viewers waited in preparation for this national spectacle, as did the Sun headquarters in Wapping.
I was the Sun's picture editor at the time, and the BBC said, tonight, watch Panorama. Martin Bashir has got an exclusive interview with the Princess of Wales. We're telling you nothing else but that. But if you don't look in tonight, you'll regret it. And we're all there waiting for the programme to start. And it starts, and Diana's voice booms across the office. And all the subs and all the reporters, instead of going home, came over and stood behind us looking at the screen.
It was the interview the UK and the BBC's own journalists had been waiting for all week. The content was shockingly frank.
Your Royal Highness, how prepared were you for the pressures that came with marrying into the royal family?
I sat in one corner of the newsroom by myself. Some of the bosses were cloistered elsewhere watching it. I think they had a bottle of wine, I did not. And I took down notes, obviously furiously.
Friends on my husband's side were indicating that I was, again, unstable, sick, and should be put in a home of some sort in order to get better. I was almost an embarrassment.
Do you think he really thought that?
Well, there's no better way to dismantle a personality than to isolate it.
I watched it at home, and I was just, it was like you don't get up and make a cup of tea. I just sat in my flat, transfixed, and watched this astonishing interview. This was like almost, she was speaking live in my sitting room and speaking to me in a way in which no member of the royal family had ever done before. And then her disappointment at what had happened in her marriage. So what began as a I have my voice became a bit of a cry for help.
The depression was resolved, as you say, but it was subsequently reported that you suffered bulimia. Is that true?
Yes, I did. I had bulimia for a number of years. And that's like a secret disease you inflicted upon yourself because your self-esteem is to low ebb and you don't think you're worthy or valuable.
Having the Princess of Wales, arguably the most popular person in the royal family, giving an interview, a no-holds-barred interview, that in itself was enough, was groundbreaking. But some of the issues that came out, I mean, bulimia in graphic detail, really. I think a lot of people don't know what bulimia, how it works, but she gave she told us how it worked.
You fill your stomach up 4 or 5 times a day, some do it more, and it gives you a feeling of comfort. It's like having a pair of arms around you, but it's temporary. Then you're disgusted at the bloatedness of your stomach, and then you bring it all up again. And it's a repetitive pattern, which is very destructive to yourself.
It's really easy now to forget how gargantuan that interview was. But when this interview happened, we were a buttoned-up society. And this wasn't just anyone. This was the future Queen of England. What she did was give permission to the world, in particular to women, to say, your feelings are valid. They're your feelings and you can own them and you can share them. And the effect was jaw-dropping, really jaw-dropping.
It was a symptom of what was going on in my marriage. I was crying out for help, but giving the wrong signals. And people were using my bulimia as a coat on a hanger. They decided that was the problem. Diana was unstable.
While the Diana interview was being broadcast, the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh chose to honour their engagement at the Royal Variety performance.
Smiles hiding any pain or anger that their daughter-in-law's interview may cause them.
But back home at the palace, the Queen's staff were watching, open-mouthed.
I had in my office at the palace several other colleagues from my own team, some from the Prince of Wales's office, and we watched it in complete silence, really. But very soon into it, I started to feel myself the pressures on Princess of Wales had been enormous. And I remember thinking, gosh, if this was my daughter, what would I want to say? And I thought to myself, actually, I would not be wanting to say, you've made a big mistake. You'd be thinking, right, what can I do? What can I do to help with this?
Prince Charles had been notoriously candid about his infidelity. Panorama gave Diana the chance to give her version of this for the first time.
Around 1986, again according to the biography written by Jonathan Dimbleby about your husband, he says that your husband renewed his relationship with Mrs. Camilla Parker Bowles. Were you aware of that?
Yes, I was. But I wasn't in a position to do anything about it.
What evidence did you have that their relationship was continuing even though you were married?
A woman's instinct is a very good one.
Is that all?
Well, I obviously had knowledge of it.
There were some key passages where, my eyes were on stalks, and I thought, is she really saying this? And she really was. Her talk about Mrs. Parker Bowles and how she felt the famous phrase, that's what everyone remembers.
Personality.
Diana would sum up her adulterous marriage in one obviously rehearsed, but nevertheless devastating sentence.
Do you think Mrs. Parker Bowles was a factor in the breakdown of your marriage?
Well, there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded.
She came out with lots of things. We changed the front page of the paper 5 times that night because better stories come up.
Shockingly, Diana now used the interview to confirm her own infidelity with James Hewitt and bear her feelings of betrayal after he went public in his book about their affair.
What was the nature of your relationship?
He was a great friend of mine at a very difficult time, yet another difficult time, and he was always there to support me. And I was absolutely devastated when this book appeared, because I trusted him. And because, again, I worried about the reaction on my children. And yes, there was factual evidence in the book, but a lot of it comes from another world. Didn't equate to what happened.
I remember I got a call from a very, very senior person at BBC News asking if I had James Hewitt's home number. You could tell there'd been an explosion in the newsroom 2 miles away.
Diana was frank about her intimate transgression.
Did your relationship go beyond a close friendship?
Yes, it did. Yes.
Were you unfaithful?
Yes, I adored him. Yes, I was in love with him.
The standout moment for me was when she questioned Prince Charles's fitness to be king and his desire to be king. This was the most damaging revelation or accusation in the whole of Panorama. This is the one that, stabbed the monarchy in the heart, really.
Do you think he would wish to be king?
There was always conflict on that subject with him when we discussed it. And I understood that conflict because it's a very demanding role, being Prince of Wales, but it's equally a more demanding role being king. And being Prince of Wales produces more freedom now, and being king would be a little bit more suffocating. And because I know the character, I would think that the top job, as I call it, would bring enormous limitations to him. And I don't know whether he could adapt to that.
Now you have the central character, boom, putting the boot right into her soon-to-be ex-husband. She knew what she was going to say. She delivered it with aplomb, as though, she was Lady Macbeth. It was phenomenal stuff.
Diana's comments about Charles becoming king infuriated his supporters, such as childhood friend Sir Nicholas Soames, seen here straight after the Panorama.
Has Prince Charles ever indicated to you what the Princess of Wales said he'd indicated, which was that he did not wish to be king?
Never. And I think that what the Princess said, with great respect to her position, was absolute nonsense.
He's never given you the slightest inkling?
Never. And I simply do not recognise it as being the case.
This was an interview that went to the absolute dark heart of the British establishment, the monarchy. And here was the Princess of Wales, the future Queen of England, talking about it in a quite disparaging way. It was explosive television, and my goodness, it caused fireworks at Buckingham Palace.
Soon after the Panorama, the Queen demanded decisive action to prevent terminal damage to the monarchy.
Princess Diana has now returned from her holiday in the Caribbean to face the question of divorce.
And in the months following the interview, complex negotiations began.
Charles is offering some £15 million, hoping this will seem generous, encouraging a speedy settlement.
Eventually, Diana received £17 million, but lost her HRH title as part of the settlement. Clearly, the programme had led to constitutional upheaval. Months later, the BBC and the Palace suffered their own split.
I had a message, could I go down to Buckingham Palace to see Charles Anson, who was the press secretary there, and who was put on his boot-face look. And what it came down to, listen, Will, we've been thinking about whether or not the Palace is inextricably linked to the BBC or not. And in part of this thinking, we've decided that we think that the Queen's Christmas broadcast ought to be shared out to other broadcasters. And I did make the point. I said, I see now. The message here is we don't get mad, we get even. And I do remember it ended with a line that few of us can really argue with. It's the Queen's decision. Ba-bom.
The Palace has always maintained that the decision to cancel the BBC's exclusive coverage of the Queen's Christmas broadcast was already in the pipeline, and not a punishment. Until now.
Will, quite rightly, as a senior executive of BBC, felt that, there was a punitive element. And we wouldn't deny that it was moving along a bit faster, but it was not moving along the racetrack at Silverstone.
I see. Sounds to me like it was a slap on the wrist.
Slight tap, I think, yeah.
The special relationship between the BBC and the monarchy was now changed irrevocably. And fatal damage was inflicted to the relationship between the BBC's Director General and its chairman, Marmaduke Hussey.
After the Diana programme, Marmaduke Hussey was intensely angry. He left the following year, and I think Hussey probably wanted John Birt to go, and John Birt wasn't going anywhere, and he was right not to go anywhere, because this had been the right decision.
Although many at the BBC regard the interview to be an expression of its journalistic independence, it has never repeated the programme.
There are a number of wonderful theories about why the BBC haven't broadcast that interview. There are still some troubling rumours about how the film was obtained, how Diana's cooperation was sought and achieved, and I think that has left the BBC slightly embarrassed about it all. Barbara Walters, the well-known American broadcaster, Oprah Winfrey, they'd all made big, heavy pitches to Diana. What was it that made her go through with Martin Bashir? Well, that remains one of the mysteries of Panorama.
This mystery would resurface some months after the Panorama programme, following a front-page newspaper investigation into the way in which the BBC's reporter, Martin Bashir, had obtained his world exclusive. In the weeks before he secured his global scoop with Princess Diana, Martin Bashir asked his friend and colleague at Panorama, a BBC graphic designer, to do a job for him, late one evening. Here, Matt Wiesler speaks on camera for the first time.
I've agreed to talk to you because I'm this guy that's remembered for forging a document. And I want to clear my name. I got a phone call from Martin Bashir and he wanted me to do a favor for him, and it was really urgent and really important. Martin asked me to make up a couple of bank statements about people being paid to do surveillance that he needed the following day. And he did say that they were just going to be used as copies. I had never been briefed in that way before. Martin said that they really had to be done by the morning as he needed them at Terminal 2. He said, I need to show them to someone. It's almost like he was inventing it as he was going along.
Soon after, Wiesler became more suspicious about what he'd been asked to do.
There was a name on one of the statements that had been used in a previous Panorama program I did with Martin. And I just thought, you can't repeat the same name in two completely different projects. It must mean that that current project you're working on is fake.
Then one night, Wiesler says he came home to find he'd been burgled. Only 2 computer disks were missing.
I was absolutely freaked out. And I searched through my computer files in the office, and I couldn't find any of the backups that I'd made of the statements that I had created for Martin.
Anxious, he went to BBC managers asking for help and expressed his concern about Bashir's documents.
I became quite paranoid because I thought there must be more to this statement story than I can ever dream of, because why would this happen? Why would someone break in? And I wasn't getting any clear answers from anyone, and I needed answers because I'd never had a break-in before in my life.
He says the BBC did little to assuage his fears, telling him instead not to talk if approached by the press. But the story about the suspicious documents leaked anyway.
I didn't approach any newspaper on this matter at all. One Sunday morning, I had a knock at the door at 7 o'clock, and I opened the door, and there was a whole gang of them out there. Some were quite rude, shouting, "Are you the master forger? Explain why you were forging documents on behalf of the BBC."
It was only then that Wiesler learnt of a possible connection to the Diana Panorama.
It made me more nervous because I thought there was something wrong with those documents. And if that ever came out, that I could possibly be in trouble.
Frightened, he says he confronted Bashir, who failed to reassure him. So, in March 1996, Wiesler finally agreed to speak to journalist Nick Fielding. It was only then that the facts began to emerge. While investigating the story, Fielding discovered that in the run-up to the Panorama, Bashir had met Earl Spencer, Diana's brother, who suspected a former member of his staff was leaking information to the press about his family. The same member of staff had featured in Bashir's faked documents.
The instructions he gave to the graphic designer were to produce bank statements, including the name of Earl Spencer's employee, former employee, and to show transfers of several £1,000s.
These faked bank statements appeared to show an offshore company, and a newspaper had been paying the Earl's employee thousands of pounds.
That would have been enough to make you very concerned indeed. And perhaps Earl Spencer, he would have been convinced that whoever had access to this kind of documentation could provide more information for him, which would enable him to get to the bottom of things. And in exchange, he may well have been willing to approach his sister and recommend that this is the person to give the interview that everybody wanted.
But it was the fake payment from the offshore company that deepened concern.
Why was it included? I think it was included because it looked like an anonymous payment which potentially could have come from someone, for example, like the security services.
Crucially, at this time, Princess Diana was known to be extremely concerned the security services might be monitoring her.
Diana certainly was very concerned about the secret services, about MI5, about MI6. There were bizarre things going on inside the households of the Prince and Princess of Wales. Her bodyguard, Ken Wharf, who left her service, he felt that he was being followed. Her confidant, Richard Kay, a Daily Mail journalist, he was burgled several times and he took to employing a private detective. My own office was broken into. But there's a catalogue of things.
The princess did suspect that she was being followed, that she was being watched, she was under surveillance, whether it was phone hacking or spying. There were occasions when we pulled up the floorboards and unscrewed the end of the telephones to see if there were any listening devices. The princess wasn't paranoid, but she was concerned.
For Morton, any evidence Diana was under surveillance could have been of great importance to her.
If Diana knew about the documents, they would have been proof positive that there were machinations against her or against others in her family and elsewhere, and they would underscore the credibility of Martin Bashir, who was insinuating himself into her life. I've spoken to friends of Diana who said, we knew all about these statements before the interview, and they had possibly tipped the balance when she was considering whether to do an interview or not.
Fielding's story about the faked documents made front-page news in the Mail on Sunday.
I should make the point, actually, that there was no legal action, no threats, no nothing from this story, other than a very anodyne response from the BBC. That these documents had been prepared for a line in the story which had come to nothing and they had been abandoned and never used.
It's also fair to say that Diana wrote a note to the head of Panorama saying that she was very happy with the way that she'd been approached and the way that the interview had been conducted.
For some, the princess's attitude does not weaken the criticisms of Bashir.
She said she was happy. But then if you if you pursue this idea that he forged a document, I mean, I don't see how her being happy at it would make any difference one way or the other, really. Of course she was happy because she was pleased the programme went out.
After the Mail article, the BBC launched an internal investigation, which found that fake bank statements had been made. But it cleared Bashir of using them, saying they hadn't been connected to the interview and that Princess Diana hadn't seen them. It was only last month that the BBC publicly admitted for the first time that Bashir had told its inquiry that the fakes were shown to Earl Spencer. BBC documents now seen by ITV also suggest that the man heading the inquiry, then Director of News Tony Hall, made no mention of this in his statements to BBC governors and senior managers. Instead, Hall concluded Bashir, who offered no reason for his actions, was honest and deeply remorseful. Hall was certain there had been no question of Bashir trying to mislead or do anything improper with the faked document. Of the BBC graphic designer Bashir had used, Hall said bluntly that steps would be taken to ensure Matthew Wiesler will not work for the BBC again. In 1999, Wiesler, who was never interviewed by the inquiry, left the industry.
In almost a naive way, I thought when you worked for the BBC, you were working for the greater good of everything. After this episode, almost all of that fell away. And I thought, what it is really about is senior management and senior producers and presenters protecting themselves at all cost. And I quite clearly felt that I was the one that was going to be the fall guy in this story. All I want is for the BBC, in this instance, to come forward and honestly make an apology, because it's had a huge impact.
Earl Spencer has now written to the BBC also demanding an apology as well as a formal inquiry into the tactics used by Bashir with him and his sister ahead of the Panorama. Although he says he did not encourage Diana to give the interview, he claims it was Bashir's use of further faked bank statements and misinformation about royal staff that helped secure the programme. Earl Spencer also said Tony Hall's BBC inquiry, which never spoke to him, was a whitewash.
What would you say to the BBC now about the matter? What would you ask them?
I would ask the BBC to come clean on this as a matter of urgency. It's been far too long. They still have an obligation to do that all these years later, because this interview was undoubtedly one of the most important interviews ever given in the 20th century.
The BBC says it has now apologised for the fake bank statements Bashir admitted showing to Earl Spencer. It told us,
"We will investigate the issues raised and this will be independent. We will set out the terms of reference in due course and do everything possible to get to the bottom of this." Unfortunately, we are unable to discuss any of this with Martin Bashir, as he is seriously unwell. Investigations at the time focused on whether the Princess of Wales had been misled. The key was the Princess's own written assertion that she had not seen the mocked-up documents and they had played no part in her decision to take part.
according to Lord Hall, it was customary at that time for sensitive matters to be aired in private, unminuted sessions before BBC board meetings. Lord Burt declined to comment. On Matt Wiesler, the graphic designer blacklisted for speaking out, the BBC made no comment. While controversy rages over how the interview was obtained and whether Diana was deceived, there is little argument that what the princess had to say was of profound significance. Her painful honesty about her private life and her views on the monarchy still resonate today.
What kind of monarchy do you anticipate?
I would like a monarchy that has more contact with its people. And I don't mean by riding around bicycles and things like that, but just having a more in-depth understanding. And I don't say that as a criticism to the present monarchy. I just say that as what I see and hear and feel on a daily basis in the role I have chosen for myself.
I think her legacy has to be measured on what changes she wrought on the royal family. They realised that the public wanted a royal family that could be more relevant to people's lives. Charles himself changed, possibly emotionally. He took on some of her aide's work, for example. Big story at the time in '97 when he went to doing things that she would have done.
Coming here today has reminded me of all of the work that Diana did before she died. I'm sure she'd be very pleased to know that I was here today.
The seed is there.
Diana also used the Panorama to make clear that she wanted their children to reach out beyond the royal family's traditional conservative role.
I want them to have an understanding of people's emotions, people's insecurities, people's distress, and people's hopes and dreams.
I think there's a new way of connecting with people that they've learnt from Diana.
You can see when Harry bends down on his knees with kids, it's just like Diana.
Diana may also have helped pave the way for the royal family to admit more independent personalities into its senior ranks.
With my husband.
Diana would have been thrilled at the arrival of Meghan into the royal family. Multicultural, multinational, great speechmaker.
But the scrutiny has proved too much and palace life too stifling, leaving the Queen with no option but to agree they can step away at the end of this month.
For some, Harry and Meghan's decision to leave the working royal family is a sign that the modernisation of the old firm still has some way to go. But Diana's Panorama was a momentous step along that road.
Diana, a year on from Panorama, said she didn't regret doing it. Diana was fighting back. She came into the royal family as practically an adolescent, innocent and unknowing and not worldly wise, but grew into this strong woman with deep concerns about social issues that she wanted to make a difference about. I think they found her a force to be reckoned with, particularly in her later years.
Why do they see you as a threat?
I think every strong woman in history has had to walk down a similar path, and I think it's the strength that causes the confusion and the fear.
I think we knew it would be revolutionary. She never lets you forget that she's part of the royal family. She is part of this firm, and she, for herself, wants to do it differently.
I was a separated wife to the Prince of Wales. I was a problem, full stop. Never happened before. What do we do with her?
Can't we pack her off to somewhere quietly rather than campaign against her?
She won't go quietly. That's the problem. I'll fight till the end, because I believe that I have a role to fulfill.
She really blew the lid off the world, in a way. It was the most extraordinary thing to do, and I think it is probably the most extraordinary thing that anyone in the royal family has ever done.